An Inconsequential Ghost, written and read by Christopher Halton. As an intelligent and open-minded man, I had long entertained the possibility that certain curious phenomena, which most would consign to myth or legend, might yet possess some foundation in truth. My skepticism was not of the dismissive kind, but rather of that tempered variety which allows inquiry without surrendering judgment. Indeed, it was precisely this attitude that often drew the attention and sometimes the irritation of earnest adherents of spiritualism who would eagerly present to me what they termed evidence of supernatural manifestations. Yet upon examination, such proofs frequently dissolve beneath scrutiny, revealing themselves to rest less upon demonstrable fact than upon conviction, supposition, or the subtle tyranny of belief. Imagine my surprise when, one morning in July of 1930, I received a letter challenging me to provide absolute proof of life after death. The terms were singularly precise. I was to present myself at a certain Westmorland farmhouse situated not far from the English-Scottish border, where the proof in question would be placed before me. The challenge came from Harold Macklin. This was no casual acquaintance. Harold and I had shared lodgings during our years at Cambridge, where winter evenings were frequently given over to earnest discussions of theology, philosophy, and the vexed question of belief. He had then been of a disposition very like my own, sceptical without being dismissive, curious without surrendering judgment. That he should now write in such a tone of certainty struck me as most extraordinary. I replied at once by telegram, anxious to establish that this was no elaborate jest. His answer was brief. If I consented to remain at his home for a fortnight as his guest, he assured me that I should leave in possession of unequivocal proof that consciousness survives bodily death. On this point he refused to elaborate. As a freelance writer, I possessed the advantage of elastic engagements, and within the week I found myself motoring northwards into Westmorland. Harold's home proved to be a substantial stone-built farmhouse standing upon a rise above the southern reaches of the Vale of Eden. From the upper fields one might glimpse, in clear weather, the long gleam of Ullswater to the west, while behind the house the fells rose in sombre tiers. The situation was at once beautiful and curiously remote, the sort of place in which ideas, once entertained, might be allowed to grow unchecked. Miriam, his wife, received me with quiet courtesy, and yet, even as I crossed the threshold, I could not entirely rid myself of the impression that I had come not merely as a guest, but as a witness. They had 2 children, Michael, a bright-eyed boy of 4, and his sister Lucy, scarcely 2 years old. Both possessed that unaffected charm which renders the presence of very young children at once delightful and faintly disarming. I confess I felt at moments a trace of envy toward Harold. Miriam was a handsome woman not yet in her mid-30s, with a composure that suggested both intelligence and quiet resolve. Their home, set high upon its rise, commanded a sweeping prospect across the southern Vale of Eden. On clear evenings the light lingered long upon the fields below. Yet such serenity was never entirely secure. In that country the weather alters with little warning. Sunshine might yield within the hour to driving rain, and I more than once observed banks of fog advancing across the hills with a curious deliberation, as though intent upon concealment rather than mere passage. Harold himself was very much the man I had known at Cambridge, civil, measured, and unfailingly courteous. If anything, there was now an increased gravity about him, though I attributed it at first to the responsibilities of marriage and estate. The journey from Sussex had occupied 2 days motoring, and I arrived fatigued in both body and mind. That first evening passed agreeably enough. We took gin before dinner, and spoke at length of our student days, of tutors, debates, and old absurdities long since forgiven. It seemed ungenerous under such circumstances to press him immediately upon the extraordinary claim that had summoned me northward. Accordingly, I retired early, postponing until the morrow the question which had begun, despite myself, to weigh rather heavily upon my thoughts. The following day was devoted entirely to domestic pleasures and the gradual renewal of acquaintance. We breakfasted late, walked the upper fields with the children, and toward midday motored down to Ullswater, whose long waters lay that morning in an untroubled calm. A light breeze moved across its surface, troubling it only enough to catch the sun in broken flashes. We lunched at a modest inn near the shore, where conversation remained resolutely cheerful. Michael displayed an earnest fascination with the boats moored along the quay, while Lucy, in the manner of very young children, alternated between solemn observation and sudden delight. Miriam spoke easily of country matters, harvest prospects, neighbouring families, parish gossip, and Harold appeared entirely at his ease. If there existed within that household any hint of the extraordinary, it did not then declare itself. I observed nothing that might have prepared me for the nature of the claim which had drawn me there. Indeed, it felt almost improper to introduce so grave a subject into the warmth of such ordinary contentment. Thus I allowed the matter to remain unspoken, surrendering myself, at least outwardly, to the simple pleasures of their company, though I cannot deny that beneath the surface of my composure there persisted a quiet expectancy. After several days of untroubled domesticity, I resolved at last to press Harold upon the matter which had brought me north. The opportunity presented itself one evening in his study, a comfortable room lined with books and faintly scented with pipe smoke. A decanter of good brandy stood between us, and the lamps had been turned low against the gathering dusk. "You know," he began after a reflective pause, his speech very slightly thickened by the evening's indulgence, "there are stories in these parts that would chill even your temperament." I regarded him more closely. "Stories of what description?" "Oh, the usual rural inheritance, apparitions upon the fells, lights seen upon the water, figures walking where no road runs. The border country breeds such things." He smiled faintly, as though aware of the vagueness of his own remark, and we shared a brief laugh at its commonplace quality. Then his expression altered. "But tell me," he said, leaning forward, "how do you know with certainty that you are alive?" The question was so abrupt that I initially assumed he was joking. "My dear Harold," I replied, "I am furnished with the usual assurances. I feel pain when struck, I see and hear distinctly, and I possess the agreeable capacity to detect when I have taken more brandy than is prudent. Those seem to me sufficient indicators of existence." He did not laugh. The silence that followed was of a different order than that which had preceded it. I set down my glass. "Very well," I said. "When do you intend to furnish this proof of yours?" He regarded me steadily for a moment before replying. "Tomorrow evening. There is a place not far from here, one of some local reputation. We shall visit it together. I believe it will answer at least part of the question that brought you north." His tone was measured, almost formal. The faint convivial haze of brandy seemed, in him, to have sharpened rather than softened resolve. "A haunted place?" I ventured lightly, "if you care to put it so." He rose then and replenished our glasses from the decanter, draining the last of the amber spirit between us. We touched rims in a gesture that, for reasons I could not then have explained, felt less celebratory than ceremonial. "To clarity," he said quietly. The final swallow burned more than the previous ones. It was late when we parted for our rooms. I recall pausing at the head of the stairs to look back toward the study. Harold still stood beside the extinguished lamp, his expression unreadable in the half-light. The following morning Harold appeared at breakfast in a condition that suggested the previous evening's brandy had not been without consequence. Nevertheless, his manner was composed, and after the children had been dispatched to their lessons, he returned to the subject of our proposed excursion. 2 miles to the east," he said, indicating the line of the fells beyond the orchard. "There stand the remains of a small Benedictine chapel. all that is left of what was once known as a Blackrig Abbey. The greater house was dissolved long ago, but the chapel walls still rise waist-high among the trees. He spoke of it without embellishment, which lent the account a certain weight. Local tradition, it seemed, held that a priest attached to the abbey had been slain there during the troubled border years of the 14th century, cut down, according to the more dramatic versions, upon the very steps of the altar. Since that time, lights had been observed within the roofless shell, pale wandering illuminations said to hover where the chancel once stood. "Will-o'-the-wisp," I suggested. "Perhaps," Harold replied evenly. "You shall judge." The description interested me greatly, though not for the reasons he might have hoped. Reports of unexplained lights are seldom as inexplicable as they first appear. Phosphorescence, marsh gases, distant lanterns refracted through mist. There are a dozen natural explanations before one need resort to spirits. I made it clear that any observation would be preceded by the most thorough examination of the ground and surrounding terrain. I had no desire to be made the dupe of atmospheric accident or of deliberate contrivance. Harold listened without objection. "That is precisely why you are here," he said. We set out shortly before dusk, each equipped with a battery torch and spare cells, a camera, and provisions sufficient for several hours' watch, sandwiches wrapped in paper, and a flask of coffee against the chill that invariably descends after sundown in that country. The walk was undertaken in near silence. The last of the day lingered low along the horizon, staining the western sky with a muted copper glow as we entered the belt of woodland Harold had indicated that morning. Blackrig revealed itself without ceremony. The chapel walls, no more than shoulder high in places, formed a rough oblong amid encroaching trees. Ivy and moss had long since claimed the stone, and the chancel end was marked only by a shallow rise where the altar had once stood. There was no roof, of course, only a lattice of branches overhead through which the darkening sky could be glimpsed. Before settling, I made a thorough circuit of the structure and its immediate surroundings. I examined the tree line for concealed lanterns, searched the ground for disturbed earth or evidence of recent human interference, and tested the footing where the soil appeared soft. Nothing suggested contrivance, no wires, no hidden recess, no telltale disturbance of undergrowth. Indeed, I became increasingly persuaded that nothing whatsoever would occur. The interior was thick with leaf mould and fallen debris, and a half-rotted tree trunk, long since toppled inward, afforded a tolerable seat from which to maintain our vigil. The air within the walls felt perceptibly cooler than in the open clearing beyond, and as the last light withdrew from the stones, the ruin seemed less abandoned than merely waiting. It may have been an hour later when a sound reached us, a low, indistinct utterance from somewhere beyond the arched entrance. It was neither sharp nor sustained. Rather, it resembled the strained exhalation of wind forced through some narrow passage. I inclined my head, listening. Harold did not stir. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. "Hear what?" I hesitated. Already the rational faculty had advanced its explanations. The fox, the owl, the shifting of timber in cooling air. The woods, once night has fully claimed them, are rarely silent. "It was nothing," I said at length. The hours that followed proved uneventful. The darkness settled into a uniform density, broken only by the occasional stirring of branches above us. My earlier attentiveness yielded gradually to restlessness, and I found my thoughts drifting to the warmth of the farmhouse and the prospect of sleep. At last Harold rose. "It is not a thing that can be commanded," he said quietly. "One must accept that sometimes nothing is granted." There was no trace of embarrassment in his tone, nor defensiveness. If anything, he appeared faintly reflective. I concealed my disappointment and assented to his suggestion that we return. Without further incident, we left Blackrig to its solitude, and made our way home beneath a sky now stripped of cloud, and curiously bright with stars. On our return through the trees, we encountered a solitary figure advancing along the path toward us. I confess he startled me, for he carried neither lantern nor torch, and yet walked with unhesitating assurance. He wore a light-coloured felt hat and a Norfolk jacket of the old sporting cut. As we drew nearer, he removed the hat politely and introduced himself as Alec Thompson, gamekeeper to the estate at Blackrig House. There was something composed about him, a man long accustomed to night. "And what brings you gentlemen abroad at this hour?" he asked, not unkindly. I answered with a candour born partly of fatigue. "We have been keeping watch in the old chapel ruins," I told him, a harmless indulgence in local legend. He laughed, though not dismissively. 40 years I've walked these woods," he said, "and I've yet to see aught that couldn't be accounted for." His eyes moved briefly past us toward the darker stand of trees. "My sight's well enough trained to the dark. If I carried a lamp, the poachers would see me before I saw them." There was a short pause. "Take care on your way back," he added. "The ground's uneven in places, and there are hollows a man might not expect." The warning seemed practical, yet something in his tone lingered faintly in my thoughts. He bade us good night, replaced his hat, and in a matter of seconds his figure was swallowed entirely by the darkness, as though the forest had resumed possession of him. Disappointed though I was, I could not deny that there had been something restorative in the experience. To sit so long beneath an open sky, within walls that had endured centuries of weather and neglect, stirred a memory of boyhood excursions long forgotten. Despite the tedium of our vigil, I felt, in some modest way, more keenly alive to the natural world than I had in many years. The night possessed an austerity that seemed to pare away the trivialities of adult life, leaving only the quiet fellowship of two men keeping watch where others once had prayed. Upon our return, Miriam was waiting in the kitchen, having evidently remained awake for our arrival. She had prepared a hot mug of Horlicks and a plate of plain biscuits, which she pressed upon us with gentle insistence. We seated ourselves at the large time-worn pine table, and Harold gave a brief account of our excursion. He spoke without embellishment. I added little. I cannot deny that I felt a certain inward reassurance. The absence of manifestation, though it might have disappointed him, seemed to me entirely consistent with my own convictions. Whatever legends attached themselves to Blackrig, the night had yielded nothing beyond wind and shadow. If proof had been promised, it had not been delivered. Both fatigued, we finished our Horlicks and retired without prolonging the discussion. I had but 2 days remaining before my return south, and Harold proposed that we spend the following day at Blackrig Hall, a modest but distinguished estate owned by his friend, Colin Richards. After breakfast with Miriam and the children, we set off across gently rising country toward the house, which stood upon slightly higher ground than the surrounding woodland. It was there, Harold informed me, that the chapel ruins properly belonged. Blackrig Hall proved to be a substantial early 19th century country residence, constructed of pale limestone-faced brick, with elegant proportions that avoided ostentation. The facade bore that restrained confidence characteristic of the period, symmetry without excess, solidity without severity. Colin Richards received us at the entrance with genial warmth. He was a portly gentleman in his mid-60s, florid of complexion, and possessed of a ready humour that seemed to arise as naturally as breath. There was nothing affected in his manner. He carried himself with the comfortable assurance of a man entirely at ease in his inheritance. He conducted us through rooms lined with ancestral portraits and watercolours of the surrounding valley. The house retained many of its original furnishings, Sheraton sideboards, heavy gilt-frame mirrors, and cabinets displaying porcelain accumulated over generations. Everything spoke of continuity rather than display. After a leisurely circuit of the grounds, he insisted we remain for luncheon, which we accepted readily. Later, settled in a comfortable drawing-room over glasses of port, their conversation turned, almost inevitably, to Blackrig. Harold gave a concise account of our vigil. I admitted with some amusement that I had encountered nothing beyond wind and suggestible imagination. Colin smiled. "My dear fellow," he said, "I have heard tales of those wandering lights since boyhood. In all my years here, I have never witnessed anything that could not be accounted for." He spoke with the easy authority of long familiarity. I hesitated only briefly before adding, "The sole moment of surprise came upon our return. We encountered your gamekeeper, Alec Thompson, patrolling the woods in admirable silence." Colin's expression altered. "You say you met Alec?" "Indeed, a courteous man. He warned us about the uneven ground." The smile had left his face entirely. "Forgive me," he said slowly, "but which way did you return?" "Through the woodland path from the chapel," Harold replied, "as one naturally would." There was a short silence. Colin set down his glass. "Alec Thompson," he said at last, "was my father's gamekeeper, loyal to a fault." He paused. "He was killed by a runaway horse in the winter of 1910. No one spoke for several seconds. The full weight of Colin's words did not at once impress itself upon me. For several moments I remained fixed in a curious suspension, as though some inner faculty had declined to interpret what had plainly been said. We had gone in search of wandering lights and ancient legend, prepared to dissect illusion from superstition. Instead, we had encountered, upon a well-trodden woodland path, in the most ordinary of circumstances, a man who, by all accounts, ought not to have been walking there at all. It was the meeting's normality that unsettled me most. There had been no pallor, no theatrical apparition, no distortion of voice or feature. Only a courteous gamekeeper, hat in hand, offering practical advice in the dark. If what Colin asserted was true, then the proof Harold had promised had been placed before us, not amid ruin and expectation, but upon the familiar road home. The end. I have now released 3 new books containing my short stories on Amazon. You can find me there by typing in Christopher Halton.